Hi everyone, this is Ricki Spencer and welcome to 2022 Sociology of Media Voices series. And we have an incredible speaker today, a clinician, Matiu Bush, who is currently doing their PhD at Deakin University, exploring some of the most incredible events that have taken place in the last 2 to 3 years, looking at COVID-19 and its development and how it's impacted our communities through our governance of researchers who have helped shape and are shaping our way forward. And I'm going to get Matiu to give us an intro to himself, his work, and then take us on a journey of some incredible research that he's undertaking. It's over to you, Matiu.
Wonderful. Ricki, thank you so much. It's great to be talking to you and to everyone that's listening. It's been an amazing period. We were between Wuhan and the vaccine, and now we're between the vaccine and the variants. And there's a lot of ground internally that we are having to navigate, but also externally. It feels exhausting. There's a lot of geography. My focus as a clinician and a public health clinician, and also as somebody who researches and asks questions and critiques, is what can we do better? And what kind of conversations do we need to design for? Better conversations. And this is where really the interplay of the media as the conversation custodians, if you like, meant much of the time of the pandemic, designing better conversations. And if we think about a field called cybernetics, it's about feedback loops. And I'm interested in how could we have designed better feedback loops around the pandemic, from experts to giving their opinion, to rolling that out into some kind of tangible policy or some type of tangible action, and then closing that back to the expert with the evidence of how it went. And I think that's important for media and for the public as well, to understand those feedback loops in times of uncertainty, when you have to make decisions at pace. So my PhD is looking at specifically quarantine, and I was involved in quarantine and had some very negative media coverage of my involvement in the pandemic. So I know firsthand what it's like to be identified as a scapegoat and have the media very much focused on the very minutiae of what I was doing in order to discredit a government that the particular focus of the media was against. So I've seen the media used during the pandemic in very negative ways, very destructive ways. So my PhD is looking about hotel quarantine facilities, and also home quarantine. And how do we do that safely? How do we gather expertise from a range of different subject matter experts across Australia and render their information, their advice useful for the organisations that are being asked to roll out such complex programs that are often developed within hours? I remember one of the, during the judicial inquiry into hotel quarantine, they said, we think in hours, not in days, not in weeks, because it was so new. It was so at pace what they were doing. So Australia's expertise, where does it lie? How is it gathered? And how is it communicated to the people that it needs to be communicated to? And then closing that feedback loop is how did it go? How did it work? What was appropriate, what wasn't? And how do we do this when we're constantly learning? So for example, we used to steam clean a lot of carpets when COVID first came around because we were very concerned about its transmission on a surface. So could it land on this phone, and then it could land on my hand, and then I could touch my mouth and get COVID. And things like that had a huge impact on the environment. We were using a lot of chemicals and a lot of water and a lot of electricity. So there was this environmental component. Same with the waste of PPE, the mountains of PPE that has been churned through. And that's all based on our understanding of the disease, the physics of disease transmission. And did we get it right? And did we get it right in each context? So what we do in ICU Is that appropriate for a drive-through outdoor facility? Is that appropriate for hotel quarantine? Is the same thing appropriate for home quarantine? And so I'm looking at how we translate that expertise to different environments and recalibrate it. And then how we recalibrate that based on a ontology, a pandemic ontology. Now, the pandemic worldview has changed. We went from zero transmission, or aiming for that, which means anyone that transmitted was a demon, was evil, was at fault, personally at fault. And we saw the naming of people who had COVID. We saw the media detail the contact tracing activities of those individuals, and then hand that over to social media for commentary. And we heard names like Barbecue Man and Kmart Guy, and these individuals who had an infectious disease went through a process which I'm sure they are still recovering from, where all of their lives became very public, and it was dangerous. There was a arson attack on a woman who tested positive and was considered and represented in the media as being somehow less responsible than others with her COVID, and her car was incinerated in her own house. It gives you an idea of the fear that was out there. And this isn't new. Those of us that worked in HIV are familiar with the victimization. Those that work with people who use drugs are familiar with the shame-based approach that certain conditions have within society. And then the social license that platforms like Facebook and Twitter and others give for a resurgence or a renaissance in public shaming. How shame and the pandemic also are very tightly intertwined. So I'll be sifting through all of these things. I'll be thinking about what do we do in the the peri-pandemic space, where we finish with COVID and it becomes endemic, and then there's no pandemic. What do we do with all the knowledge that we've learned, all the capability? How do we all put it on the shelf waiting for the next pandemic? And then how is it all reanimated without us going through the same thing of, oh, what do we do? What do we do? And having that amnesia to everything we've just gone through, and start to make the same mistakes again. The same mistakes with messaging, with expertise, with getting expert opinion and operationalizing that very quickly. We're going through that again the next time we have a pandemic. So interested in that space in between pandemics, in something what I call the pandemic commons. Now, we don't have all of the resources to respond to natural disasters, so therefore it exists distributed across many different sectors. And in hotel quarantine, we worked with aviation crew who are out of work, police, the military, and a whole range of others who were available to come in and work in short notice because they didn't have jobs, and also the hospitality industry. So what you get is a clash of all of these industrial cultures. So it's a very unusual group to be working with. And we'll go through that same process because all the resources we need are distributed elsewhere. And you've got to pull that together. It's a coalition, it's networked, and it's not always done under cooperation, because all of these groups don't necessarily want to be doing this type of work, but have to do it, or are legislated to do it because of the pandemic. So it's a very unique industrial culture that exists within the pandemic commons. And it's all going to get busy doing other things, but in time of national emergency, everything has to be redirected to the most important thing, which is preventing infection, managing return travelers, managing hospitals, etc. So I'm really interested in the commons as a concept, and how we use the commons, the creative commons, the knowledge commons. There's so many commons that we use, but there's a pandemic commons as well that forms and becomes a coalition, either cooperatively or non-cooperatively. And it's the non-cooperation that causes us the biggest dilemmas, because one thing we know about COVID, it finds every weak link in Australia's systems it's political systems, it's healthcare systems, it's communication systems. So that's what's going to be keeping me busy over the next 3 years.
That's incredible, Matiu. And I guess for everyone who's listening, let's just sort of start. What is quarantine? And let's just get right to that essence. And why is quarantine so important in the context of COVID-19?
Let's start with that pandemic ontology, that pandemic worldview. When you're chasing zero transmissions, and it's a target, and you're not allowing a level of infection within the community, because it's intolerable to have that. So for those people that are the highest risk of having it, you have to physically isolate them. And that's definitely in the case where infections are airborne or droplet transmission. So if someone breathes, and then from the body fluids and from the air that we breathe out, if there's a risk of transmission, the only way to manage that is to segregate those individuals for a period of time until they're no longer infectious. And our initial worldview understanding of COVID was that it was transmitted that way specifically, more droplet. We weren't so convinced on airborne. So therefore, removing that population from the general public meant we could achieve in our minds, in our collective mind, zero transmission. Here is this cohort that could be infective. We hold them for a period, then we release them once they are free from infection. So therefore, the general community can maintain zero. Now, that's had to change several times because of our change in our pandemic ontology, our worldview, where with vaccination, we weren't chasing zero anymore. And certainly with Omicron, we were tolerant of a certain level. We've seen the tolerance level really be stretched in a discordance between what the experts were happy with and would tolerate compared to what society was prepared for. And that's exactly, Ricki, as you talk about the role of communication in between those two phenomena. And this is, again, fascinating stuff. So yes, that's what we mean by quarantine. And then over time, we've developed places where people can quarantine. So it's no longer specifically a hotel. And hotels were chosen because it was practical, they were all empty. But it wasn't practical because they weren't purpose-built based on the physics of COVID transmission. So therefore, there was a disconnect there as well. So quarantine could happen in facilities, and historically it's happened in purpose-built facilities, and we've had remnants of those. And we've had remnants of a range of incarceratory locations in Australia's history and around the world. But we're building purpose-built facilities again. So we've got them in most states and territories are building their own purpose-built facilities. And I went to Howard Springs and saw that purpose-built facility. So you get a sense of what it's like to go into a camp that's dedicated to stopping and trapping a virus until that virus exhausts itself and can no longer spread to the community. So quarantining can happen in a purpose-built facility. It can happen in a facility that's not purpose-built at our peril, and we've experienced that. And it also can happen at home. And we're seeing hybrid approaches all around the world. And it all depends on the government's worldview. What are they targeting? And that tells you whether quarantining is useful or not.
I was going to ask too, Matiu, for the general public, it was kind of a real educational eye-opener, because for the first time in many people's lives, the notion of the word pandemic was something that was very, dare I say, use the word foreign, that it was something that was perhaps seen as something that happened in only a certain segment of the world, that happened in a world that perhaps didn't have certain facilities or resources. How did that play out in terms of what happened with COVID, like for people, I guess, like yourselves who were involved in that? Did we have much preparation when it was first said, or how did it sort of, how did people come together, like experts, and and to form, and yeah, very interesting how this started to emerge.
It's amazing. We have reached, I think, peak health literacy. To hear the media certainly talk about reproductive rate, to hear individuals know what an epidemiologist is, know about droplet airborne transmission. So the amount of personal learning and personal responsibility and health literacy amongst the general public is, I think, at an all-time high. People know about variants, mutants, spike proteins, rapid antigen testing, PCR testing. That's incredible. When the lectures that you used to take in public health and doing the Masters of Public Health, you're hearing all of those terminologies on TV and spoken about daily in the media. You know the world has definitely changed. So yes, we've reached a health literacy and understanding, and because the virus is hyper-personal, it's hyper-biological, it's infecting your cells, but then it's infecting others in your family and your community, and then it's hyper-global. So it spans the trajectory of our mindscapes, the personal and the global, and then it impacts us in our political realm, and then through policy and policing. And so therefore, and then through, as we spoke about previously, around misinformation as well. So it is an absolute crucible where all of these things are just mashed together under pressure, under heat, and under tremendous risk. So an extraordinary thing we've all gone through, hyper-local, hyper-global, impacting us personally. We can't move. We had curfews, 5 kilometre radius, etc. We had lockdowns. We stayed at home. Now we are self-imposing and looking into ourselves and saying, oh, what can I do to keep myself safe? Many of us have had COVID and gotten through the other side. So we've got a sense of we're more relaxed because we may have been vaccinated, we may have had COVID as well, and we feel surely we've got enough immunity to go out and enjoy life. So there are complex responses, and it's been a very, very busy time, although we have been cognitively exhausted about focusing on COVID for so long. And I think every time a new variant comes out, the sigh of, oh, isn't this over? Haven't we marinated in this stuff for long enough? What's interesting around expertise is the expertise has always been there, but it has struggled whether it's been funded and valued, especially in what Catherine Bennett talks about as this sort of peri-pandemic space, in between pandemics, what happens? And funding drops, and after SARS and MARS, there were excellent reports written, and I think the judicial inquiry in Victoria demonstrated that there were excellent documents produced by leading experts. And what's interesting, not all experts are the same, and there has to be a weighting. So a public health opinion and an infectious disease opinion and an infection prevention and control opinion are all different things. So they might be on the same sliding scale, if you like, or spectrum. But it is important that each of them is weighted, and then so that it can be interpreted into a policy reality or also an operational reality. So you can't have negative pressure rooms, which may be an infectious diseases opinion or infection prevention and control opinion. You can't have that in the community. You can't have that in the home, and you certainly can't have it in hotel quarantine. So therefore, those types of opinion have to be have another lens of public health and practicality put upon them, and also what is the social license to do these types of quarantining and management of population in the pandemic. So I think that's been the challenge for Australia, is to ensure that though all of those experts' opinions are weighted and have the appropriate lens put on them before they're rolled out. And that can be the use of nebulizers, that can be the use of CPAP machines. All of those things need to be worked through. It could be, do we need to be steam cleaning carpets and cleaning windows after every COVID person walks past? And coming to an answer that is the most appropriate based on the most evidence at that time, where no one specialty group has dominance. Because if you take the people that work in ICU and try and protect ICU staff from COVID, what they do cannot be rolled out in hotel quarantine. So there has to be a translation of context, of environment. And that's important, and that takes time to learn and mature. And that's where representation is incredibly important. Who are on the expert committees? And do we have enough variety of all of the different health tribes and public health tribes? Do we have enough variety so that we have opinion that is rendered incredibly useful to the people who have to do the work, often the public health nurses, public servants, etc., who have to roll it out. So I think that's why it's so important to do this autopsy on Australia's response and spend time reviewing Australia's response. Because if we don't do it, we run the risk of in the peri-pandemic space, in between pandemics, all of that knowledge and rich learning goes. And we don't want to write reports and policy direction documents that don't do anything, that sit and wait until somebody reads them before the next pandemic. But the thing about pandemics is they happen out of the blue, generally on public holidays or major world holidays, when all of the resources aren't around, and all of the resources you need are busy doing other things. And that's why it's so important to have a contemporary preparation plan for pandemic for all countries, and to maintain centres of excellence for it, so that when well-funded centre of excellence, so when a pandemic comes along, you don't want to discover that your centre of pandemic excellence only has 2 people in it that are part-time because there's no funding for it. And I think Australia and other countries have suffered because there's not that central centre of disease control, for example.
That's incredible. And I think for some of us, it was the first time that we even took, I guess, a lot of notice to, I guess, the World Health Organization and the chief, the CEO, if that's the correct title, and I'll probably, if you can, and I think it was Dr. TASA, if that's correct.
Yes.
And speaking to the world about the pandemic and kind of going through, leading the way forward as to how do we address it. And how has that sort of that language of, we're working universally, through different spaces in time, yet we're all in this common scenario where we're all impacted. How does that work? How did that play out in Australia in terms of getting the people connected with the World Health Organization?
Yes, I think when the stakes are high, it's been my observation that the goodwill to communicate effectively and to reduce territorial boundaries is absolutely there. And my lived experience working in the pandemic was of very diverse groups dropping everything to come and help. They were highly motivated to help the citizens of Australia and to reduce transmission. So the goodwill is absolutely there. What it does show is if you think of COVID like an acid wash, it revealed all of the fault lines in our diplomatic relations, in our communications and relationships with one another, whether that be state and federal, Labor Liberal, and also internationally. And we saw those tensions with a long-standing particular attitude and stance against China from certain Western democracies, and how COVID became intertwined with other things, rendered useful for those people who had particular ideologies. And then we also saw, and it will always be a complex picture, but we also saw the most amazing scientific collaboration. The COVID genome being published on open source, the amount of rapid clinical trials. I think clinical research and research in general, the ability to write articles and have them published and pre-published state and then socialize so people could start to explore further and make decisions because their lives were at risk. And that was tremendous. The vaccination, development of the vaccine showed tremendous international collaboration that was incredible, unprecedented, something that we hadn't seen, but we also hadn't seen because we didn't have an extrinsic threat that was about to kill millions of people. So in that way, Ricki, tremendous hope for the future, tremendous hope that these pathways of communication and supply and the knowledge commons and the scientific commons opens up, where we start to not see ourselves as Australia, New Zealand and other countries, but see us all as this one global community united. So there was beautiful, beautiful connections made, and let's hope they endure. And it also showed the importance of United Nations, World Health. We saw their incredible relevance in as being global leaders for the health of the world, who aren't so concerned about their own geographical borders, who could think globally about the planet and take us to that horizon line about the pandemic globally, before we started to be so concerned about specifically in Australia.
I guess one of the messages at one of the stages that I kind of struck me was the language, and there was I think 2 words that kind of took me back to late 80s, and that was the word patient zero. And I'm just wanting to get your kind of take on that, because at one stage there was a focus to try, the media was sort of looking at, dare I say, blame or causality, like they wanted to have that one critical moment. And I know some of that was sort of, unfortunately, with Trumpism and looking at to blame. How did that did that distract away from what people like yourselves were trying to do, or was that part of the journey of the pandemic COVID-19 experience?
Yeah. So looking at scapegoat theory, and I think if we go back to understanding what a scapegoat is and the process and the machinery of scapegoats, and I would like to place that in a particular phenomena, which is the shame industrial complex. Mm-hmm. If you look at the shame industrial complex, you have media that writes articles, you have social media platform that enjoy traffic, whether it's negative or positive. So if it's a fluffy puppy, great, but if it's somebody who's accused of something, even better. Mm. So then they also have the citizenship who will also engage in shaming and scapegoating. So you can just hand them over a name over to the citizenry, and public shaming will occur. Now, if you are a scapegoat, and I think when you're looking at investigations into patient zero, you're looking for a name on somebody. You're looking to name and create a focus or a locus for a phenomena that's invisible. And so COVID, which is invisible, we cannot see it, yet it's wreaking so much havoc on our lives. In a sense, it's quite magical. It manages to fly through the air and infect us all, and is now mutating continuously, so evading us. It's all powerful. And what we tend to do with scapegoats, and historically, if you look at the literature on scapegoat theory, is that we also, when we find a scapegoat, is we give them the same attributes. We make them responsible for something they cannot be responsible for. And we saw that through HIV and others, definitely sexually transmitted infection, where there's a degree of shame. We see that in bariatric medicine, where there's so much shame put on the person whose body mass index is different from what's considered optimal. And in many other conditions, such as lung cancer, we look for the individual to find the source of the evil that we're frightened of, even though the source of evil has nothing to do with that individual. But we need somebody. It's this ancient bloodlust, and we haven't yet evolved. Probably our frontal lobes have not yet evolved to desire some kind of bloodlust. And what's incredibly interesting in the pursuit of patient zero, or for example, the young, and often it is very much linked to a process of othering. So if they can find a patient zero who has aspects of them that can be othered, skin color, gender, sexuality, age, it will be othered, disability, it will be othered. And then they're able, then all of those ancient prejudices come out, because they can look at that individual who's patient zero. This person brought COVID to Tasmania, to Western Australia, etc., and look at their otherness. And then that can just tap into a citizenship who's frightened and go, our old prejudices are confirmed. That individual, I always knew that type of person was untrustworthy. And then the avalanche of social shaming continues, and off it goes. All of those snowflakes creating this avalanche of hatred, which results in a really typical playbook for those that have been identified in the press. Now, what was interesting with this pandemic, it was also targeted scientists, epidemiologists, and healthcare workers. So it is not uncommon for healthcare workers also to be named and shamed, and I've had a lived experience of that. And there's a particular playbook, which is a lot of hatred on social media. And then what happens for those that are antisocial, the amount of citizen shaming that they're seeing gives them license to be even more antisocial. So death threats are, you can just almost tick off the checklist of what happens. And it's quite common for healthcare professionals, for the patient zeros who've been named in media, to experience death threats, attacks, and loss of jobs. And also what I call algorithmic harm, because once your name is in the media associated with a pandemic, then the Google search optimization will always have those articles there. So therefore it affects your employment, you'll lose positions. And so there is a very long, if you think about long COVID, well, there's long public shaming where people are still impacted years afterwards, after being named. So when you talk about, and I'm glad, Ricki, you raised that patient zero, it taps into a very, very ancient bloodlust, look for a scapegoat and someone to blame, and within that is tied up with all of our ancient prejudices, because when we discover characteristics of those individuals that reinforce our biases, the process of othering continues, and then it's reinforced. And from a media platform or a social media platform, it's hate for pay. They have no concern whatsoever. And so individuals can be openly vilified for having an infection or being infectious, and everyone feels justified on the pile-on because of the audacity of this virus to come and impact their lifestyles.
And that's such an incredible moment, because as you're speaking, the first thing that I thought of, and again it comes back to where you open up the conversation about quarantining, is the image of the towers. I think it was in Flemington Towers, if I'm correct, and the notion of the announcement that people had to quarantine for a period of time, and all of a sudden all sorts of things started to emerge. And as you're talking about the hatred and policing, it became an issue. Why are people being made to, and I'm just wanting to get your kind of opinion on that. Did that at all make it more difficult for your community that you're working in to work through it, where you had this added pressure? Did you feel the media sway turning on the work you're doing because of all of a sudden it became almost a class, back again, dare I say it, vulnerable people in towers, refugees being locked into a space? And
all of that, it's unusual to head to work and see your work being trending on Twitter, and also to hear the people that you trust and esteem being vilified on social media. And for those, it is hard to connect with senior people and see how intent they are on doing good, and then yet to via social media to read so much negative things about them when it's light years from the truth. And yet it exists and it perpetuates. So the towers was an interesting time, deeply affected those that were impacted, and also operationally was incredibly difficult to manage. Yet again, it goes back to the pandemic ontology. They were aiming for zero transmissions. So therefore, things that normally wouldn't be permissible become permissible because of that worldview. We don't want a potentially infectious group to interact with the rest of the community because we're trying to do the most good for the most people. So that's when I go back to representation in experts. It's, have we got all the right experts in the room? Do we have ethicists, and do we have representatives of those particular communities who understand culturally what it's like to have police turn up in their house back in their home country, and the sort of fear to see army on the streets, etc., and how that impacts and not gives you the result that you want. So all of that cultural sensitivity, and it really came down to a lot of communication. And subsequently, when they used a lot more cultural channels for communicating with a diverse cohort of people that may be infected, they had a much better result, incredible result. So that's why doing the review, the reflective autopsy on how we manage these things is so important. So next time, the police aren't the first people on the ground, that potentially it's cultural workers. And that's saying nothing negative about the police. The police I worked with were very much focused on doing the most good for the most people and trying to themselves understand and protect themselves from COVID. So again, when we're doing something in the name of public health, we're using, because all of the resources are distributed, we're using people we wouldn't normally use. We're not using nurses and doctors or public health community workers. We're using police, we're using ADF or the Defence Force because we didn't have enough people to work with us, or we're using new groups like authorised officers to give letters out that were directions, public health directions. That's where you get a range of different industrial cultures all merging. And that's where leadership comes in. How do you lead all of this diverse group of people to then go into the towers and deliver a good experience that keeps people safe, but also balances human rights as well, and the role of human rights and the role of personalised traumatic experience. And how to do all that within 12 hours, Ricki, is very, very difficult. And I think that certainly what I do with senior people who have to make these decisions, I go with empathy with them, that they must be under incredibly significant pressure, and so to look at them with empathy first and goodwill first, that they must have made this decision. And I don't know all of the information that they have, but it's not as certain particular commentators on the government's pandemic response see nothing good in anything that they've ever done. It's always negative. And also then the personal attacks that happen to, for people like the Cho and others, whose lives would have been drastically changed from their involvement. Yet tough decisions have to be made. And then asking, how do we make these tough decisions? How does large groups of people be segregated until they're no longer infectious? What are the options? How to do it ethically and with a human rights perspective, but also a public health perspective as well. These are decisions that are made in the crucible. The heat is on, and yet someone has to give a direction within hours. And that's why the understanding of expertise and how Australia gathers this expertise is so important.
It's incredible, Matiu, as you're speaking, because I just keep thinking of the difficulty that a lot of the experts who had to front the media, every day in, day out. And I remember some of the horrible questions that some people asked, like about, do you have the deaths on so-and-so people on your conscience or in nursing homes? And it was just the look I noticed sometimes that sadness on people's eyes, that all they were trying to do was best, and yet these attacks about that was just could not be helped with the resources and the way the pandemic had obviously infiltrated our communities. And it's just, but yet, you, as you said, we're still looking at scapegoating. That language of scapegoating was sort of fueling the media cycle as another option. And how did that, like for yourself, and I guess I want to now shift it to someone like yourself, what impact has this made on your life and your journey? Is it now a process that you're going through some form of post-traumatic stress where you're kind of dealing with that heightened anxiety and arousal for so long, because it has now been such a long period, looking at trends, at predictory factors? Where does that sort of sit with people who are involved with quarantine now?
Look, that's such a good question. When, for those of us who have Vietnam veterans in their family, it's interesting that Vietnam veterans talk about the phenomena of coming back from Vietnam, of doing the best job that they thought their country was asking them to do, and have had such a hostile reaction. And so there are similarities in the sense that some of us who work in pandemic response and no longer don't talk about it, don't talk about their involvement in it, are very nervous to mention it to anyone because it was a very controversial program. And there are aspects of decisions that were made by the government, whether that be state and federal, that elicit strong opinions in others. So it's like this hidden war, if you like. And for many of us, it's as close as we'll come to war, because we had an enemy that was definitely invading our shores and causing death in the citizenry. So it is a public health emergency. So I think going back to the question around the media and those attacking the leaders, the role of the media is to absolutely hold truth to power. But when they reduce that into the cheap shots that we saw, and also the constant call for resignations, which is hysterical, because if everyone resigned who was asked to resign, I just wonder, is there been any reflection to understand the pool of candidates that are left? And certainly when you work with some very effective individuals who you see on the media, there's calls for their resignation. And you wonder, do those who are calling for the resignation have any understanding of how to assess competency? Because these individuals are incredibly competent, and you may not find a long list of people ready to fill their shoes. And in fact, it's so detrimental to leadership that people won't go for those positions because of the media scrutiny and the impact on their life. The fact that you have to employ increased security for your home because people will turn up and there may be physical attacks. And this is why public leadership is, if we complain about the lack of leadership in public office, well, what are the contributing factors for that? And we saw that in those media conferences. What it does is sets up such a negative dynamic of us and them, or leaders and then the press. And what happens is a lot of nuanced conversation was missed. And certainly a lot of nuanced questions were missed, which were much deeper and much richer. So in choosing a very obvious story, there were so many other stories that were left untold. And I think that is unfortunate, because there were very rich stories, because every day there were flights coming in full of people who were here for bereavement visits, who were going to hospitals and turning off life support systems to their loved ones. And there were workers who would don PPE and drive them to palliative care units, drive them to roadsides where an accident had happened, drive them to funeral homes to attend the funeral of their loved ones, all in PPE, and no infection occurred in that community. So there are incredible stories of the pandemic, of the Australian Open, where we pulled off last in the year that it was done during the pandemic, 21. Over 2,000 people arrived and only one worker got COVID in the end. And that was 3 hotels that were run, thousands of people involved. and we were the only country in Australia to do it. So the ability to tell other stories was dominated by a very obvious story, in a sense a lazy story of "you're to blame, will you resign?" when there was so much more to go through and to explore. So I think, is there PTSD? I think there is, and for me personally and for others, and I think there's a process that will take time to integrate this into your work history for people that worked in the pandemic response, for people that worked in the towers, and how they talk about that, how they process that, and how they come to peace with it over time. And that's the work that is in front of us all, and art therapy on psychologists and journaling and all the good practice, all the good mindful reflective practice helps people to help it find its place in their lives, and then also to start to see the great things that they learned. And certainly I learned tremendous amounts working with so many diverse people in a context that was high pressured. And when you do 18-hour days and get up the next day and still have energy for the task, you know that the work environment is excellent. And so some of the most enjoyable moments of my working career were working in that hotel quarantine with such diverse people, all wanting to do the very best for the general public. So it takes time to rediscover those stories and start to tell yourself new stories about or the untold stories of all the good that was done, and playing a much longer game. And I think the PhDs helps do that. It writes some of the wrong narratives that were out there about individual performance, but also about the entire system as well.
Bush, it's been an incredible journey listening to your incredible story of survival, strength, and there's so much more. And I'm hoping you can come back, because I would like on the second podcast is to perhaps dwell more in explaining to people perhaps the issue of contract tracing, what we've learned from it, and also the future of quarantining and the future in planning for quarantine spaces around the world. And I think that's an important area. But on behalf of everybody listening, just want to thank you for saving our community and keeping us safe. And you and your team and all the workers have really helped us stay strong and survive. And yeah, thank you. And it's been an absolute pleasure. If people would like to know more about your research, how can they get in touch with you?
I'd love them to follow me on LinkedIn. I think that's a really good place to start. I'm off Twitter at the moment, having experienced a good personal shame, a public shaming on Twitter. So I'll venture back there soon enough, but at the moment I'm not on Twitter. So LinkedIn is the great place to connect with me, and I'd welcome any new connections.
Fabulous. Well, thank you so much for your time. And we look forward to the second part where we can discuss the future of quarantining and pandemics and what we've learned from our current situation. Thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure, Ricki. Thank you so much.